questions, depending on what they cover, and then, as standard, we'll open it up to the audience for questions and comments on the questions preferred. So, Toby, can we start with you then, please?
By all means, well, thanks ever so much for that introduction, Paul. I'd like to start by thanking the... very much, yeah, very well. Always time my tea's arrival just gone through. Start by thanking the IPPR and WWF and LSEF for this really important session. I think, as you said, Paul, very timely following Steve's speech yesterday. And IPPR and WWF have been real field leaders on these issues for some time, so their contribution is going to be incredibly important. And also really welcome the contribution of LSEF, who are already, I think, making their presence very strongly felt in this in the party at what is a really crucial time. As Paul mentioned, I am the chair-elect of the Environmental Audit Select Committee following the election last week. I won't be the actual chair until we have a committee, which should be in the next couple of weeks or so. But I hope that the committee will enjoy very productive relationships with all stakeholders over the coming Parliament. I think it is a committee that has had real impact in the past, and I'm determined that it will continue to do so in the future. I'm sure it will, and has been said many times today, that our country is one of the most nature depleted in the world. This fact has disastrous consequences for all of us, and it must guide the urgency of policy change. The Environment Act was a genuinely groundbreaking piece of legislation by the last government. Legally binding targets on nature and the environment, held to account by an independent regulator in the Office for Environmental Protection, was actually exactly the kind of bold thinking and accountability that government needs to take on the nature crisis. But the OEP confirmed that Britain's off track to meet any of those commitments on nature and on the environment, including the goal to halt biodiversity loss. The introduction of the environmental land management schemes in a move away from basic payments was another progressive and welcome step, but the problem has been the implementation of these schemes and targets rather than the schemes themselves in the first place. The transition to ALMS has been shambolic. Hundreds of millions allocated by Treasury to support farmers have been handed back to the Treasury unspent because previous ministers were not able to get that money out the door. And with this record, the scale of the challenge is clear, and a Labour government cannot get on with this quickly enough. The Secretary of State has been unequivocal in his ambition. He is intent on this government being the most nature positive that we've ever had. Within weeks, we've seen a water bill to make sure that bosses at failing water companies are held to account for their sewage spills. We've seen commitment to a rapid review of the Environment Improvement Plan to set out what's needed to meet the EA goals. The new farming minister has wasted no time in getting out there and meeting farmers face to face. With COP16 just weeks away, it was great to see nature being taken so seriously in the Foreign Secretary's Q speech. We'll have a new climate envoy, and for the first time ever, an envoy for nature. So all of those are really positive first steps under this government. But as the chair of the EAC, I want to make sure that positive start is backed by the actions that are needed. Water was a defining issue in my time as Shadow Minister for Nature. Anger across the country on the performance of water companies was unmistakable, and rightly so. Sewage has flown freely into our waterways, desecrating our beauty spots and posing a very real threat to health. So I welcome the water bill, which give real meaning to the Secretary of State's warnings to the sector. We must also reflect on the precarious nature of many operators in the sector, how we got to a point where the indebtedness of the water provider for our capital city has led it to the brink of collapse as it matches its environmental failure with an economic one. The commitment to maintain ELMS as opposed to starting from scratch is absolutely sensible, but none of us will envy Daniel Zeitler, the farming minister's task in unscrambling that current failure. Part of solving ELMS is finally developing a plan of how land is used. The last government promised a land use framework that never delivered. It is incumbent on this government to bring forward that plan as soon as possible to help mediate the competing demands on land use. A rapid review of the Environment Improvement Plan is urgently needed, but we need to make sure that the scale of that review holds hope of genuinely tackling the deficit that already exists. Access has also been raised by the Secretary of State. It's become a vexed issue with strong views on both sides, but having hinted at an extension of rights, the Department must say more about what that new approach to access will be and what the impact will be on nature. Finally, the government has made a fast start on nature. I really applaud the ambition of its plan, getting legislation on the blocks quickly and starting the journey of our return to the national, international stage. The signs are good, but we must wait to see what more they bring forward to ensure those highly ambitious targets to avert the nature crisis are matched with the scale of ambition needed to actually get on top. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Toby. A really good overview of the breadth of the issues that we'll talk about today, and also the challenges like you as a chair are going to be facing over the next 5 years as well. Thanks for that. Angela, if I come to you next, so that word WWF thinking on this.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Toby. That's really helpful to hear, and it's really important at a time we might not have an opposition really scrutinising it the way that we need them to, that we've got select committees really holding government to act in the way you've set out, so that's really good to hear. And I come from an economics background into the environment sector, so I always love to sort of say the opportunities that come here, but I am going to say where we are in terms of the state of nature, because it's really important to hear, because it shows how much we've got to act, and exactly as Toby says, the UK is one of the bottom nations in terms of nature depletion. We're one of the worst in the G7. Nearly 1 in 6 species in the UK is threatened with extinction. In the UK, we have got nearly a quarter of all our mammals will go extinct. Globally, it is just as bad. We do a Living Planet index with the Zoological Society, and in 2022 it showed that we had lost 69% of the planetary species. The next edition of that report is coming out in a month. We are not expecting it to have improved. It could be worse. It's absolutely devastating. And the climate and nature crisis is not just an environmental crisis, and people are understanding this now. It's an economic crisis, it's a moral crisis, it's a social crisis too. And the people who are most vulnerable are also feeling this loss of nature. So they're the ones who are at greatest risk, and they're already suffering. In the UK, it's the people who are living in drafty houses, who don't have access to nature, who can't cope when there's an energy price spike or when there's a food price spike, which happens more and more frequently the more we kind of just steamroll into this crisis. And around the world, it's those communities who are threatened by extreme weather, or who are vulnerable to wildfires and climate change. So we are doing it for the species, but we are doing it for those people too, and they are our canary in the coal mine, literally, of the thing that we're about to face. The businesses that are currently working hardest on this are not seeing a clear signal that they're going to be rewarded, and they are having to compete with somebody who is businesses that aren't acting. So if we are to reverse the loss of nature, we need to turn all of that around and get ourselves on track to deliver against climate change. There is so much to do in this decade. This was supposed to be the decade of delivery. If anybody remembers that we started up, and we are already in 2024 and we haven't been doing much delivery. Labour have inherited a pretty bad situation. We have got plans that haven't been implemented, as Toby just outlined. We've got plans that don't really add up. And we've got commitments that aren't being delivered. So we need to now take stock of where we are, but we need to take stock quite quickly and then move into action. We're feeling optimistic. At WWF, we've seen the action on water, the speedy action on the energy infrastructure, on GB energy. We've seen the interest that government are taking in COP CBD in Colombia, and David Lamy's speech. We attended at Kew and are really pleased to see the UK taking that leadership position. And we know that change won't happen magically overnight, but we need to start seeing that whole system approach permeating through government. So it's not just energy, it's the whole of the climate agenda and its nature as well. And we see nature not as just a silo metric. We are a nature charity, but we have very quickly got to the point of saying we're also a climate charity and we're also a people charity. And that's a big question that kind of, for us, comes down to how we use our land. So how do we use our land to serve those three elements? Function as a climate sink, function for nature restoration, and function for our well-being, particularly via food production and nutrition. So the UK's own food security index showed in the last report that nature loss is the biggest single threat to our long-term food security. And all these things are interconnected. If we don't deal with the nature crisis, we have flooded homes. If we don't reduce the runoff into water, we will continue to have dirty rivers and higher water bills as a result. If we don't make ourselves healthier, we will continue to put a strain on the NHS. So all of these things we do are about how we invest in things that save us costs in terms of public services and make us a healthier society. So we're long overdue this honest conversation. We have got out of our silo. We're really thinking about how we do this with farming. We're working with all the farming organisations to do this together. I think we're in a very lucky position in the UK that we have got a farming sector that understand they need to address the climate crisis and the nature crisis. They want our support to do it. They want the government support to do it. And we need to work with those people who depend on those landscapes and who live in those landscapes and seascapes to make sure we're taking that forward. So the key thing to say for us at the start is that nature is for everyone. It is not an elite thing. We're out of, hopefully now, a kind of culture war where the implication is some elite agenda that is imposing costs. It's actually an agenda that's going to be really important for the vulnerable. And we're really grateful for the support that Labour have shown to this agenda so far. Look forward to working with them and pressing them strongly, as Toby said, to deliver as we go forward.
Thanks so much, Angela. Really good on the interconnectedness of all of this as well. Joseph, if we can go to you next.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, I mean, the question of this event is what is Labour's plan for restoring nature? I mean, Toby set out some really fantastic first steps, and I think those are things that we can and should celebrate. Recommitting to those crucial Environment Act targets, reversing the decline of nature, protecting nature in 30% of the land and 30% of the seas. These are vital targets, and the recommitment to them is really key. The really evident, strong political focus on pollution of water. We've seen that already in some of Steve Reed's announcements, and I think that's a positive development. That is now part of national conversation and clearly a really core part of Labour's plans. And then finally, Labour clearly know that there is a major transition underway in the agricultural sector. They're clearly on the side of farmers, want to work with farmers to ensure that those changes work for them. And so those are things we should celebrate. But there's much more that needs to be done. Clearly, a lot of the detail I think will come in the Environmental Improvement Plan update, which we look forward to seeing. And that really, as Toby set out, we need the detailed action plans now. The previous government established this framework of environmental targets and failed to put us on track to meet them. So that's a really key next step for the government. But I think really overall we can start to think about how can Labour start to talk about nature in a way that connects to their missions and it connects to their story, how they want to change the country. We've heard from the Prime Minister today about this decade of national renewal, or could that also be a decade of natural renewal? We think so, and we think there's ways to connect nature restoration to Labour's missions. Nature is, as Angela's pointed out, it's not just an environmental concern, it's an economic and a social question as well. It connects to what the Chancellor talks about, security. Security for farmers, security for consumers in being able to buy food even as climate shocks increase. But security for natural habitats and protection and restoration of them. It also connects really evidently to issues of fairness. Access to nature is unequal. We know the health benefits it brings. That should clearly be part of a Labour government's agenda. And the flip side of fairness is obviously we should expect to see those who pollute our natural environment pay to clean it up. And finally, there are ways to connect this to Labour's story of national renewal. Nature and the environment bring so many economic benefits. The Dasgupta review laid many of them out, and starting to talk about the economic benefits of investing in nature is going to be really important. But I think the other side of that question of national renewal is, what is this government going to leave next generations? Previous Labour governments have left a natural inheritance for future generations. You know, the national parks introduced by Clement Attlee's government, the country parks introduced by Harold Wilson's government, and even kind of rights of responsible access left by the new Labour government and the Labour-led government in Holyrood at the start of this century. So yeah, I think that's what we want to see next. How can Labour start to put nature at the heart of their agenda? And actually, Toby, I'm really glad you mentioned access, because I think access is key. How can ordinary people, we have these environmental restoration targets. Nature, we want to see it flourishing in the next decade. How can the rest of us, how can ordinary people around the country enjoy that kind of flourishing nature? So promising signs, but lots more to do.
Thanks, Joseph. And then Megan.
Thanks so much, everyone. I'm Megan. I'm the sustainability correspondent at the New Statesman, and one of my favourite parts of my job is writing about nature, because, full disclosure, I actually volunteer for the London Wildlife Trust, so outside of my job I'm a bit invested in it as well. I say that I'm going to kind of lay out a couple of quite depressing things from a report which the Green Finance Institute brought out earlier this year with the University of Oxford, which kind of set the scene for how, if we continue on our current trajectory, our economy might be affected. So, under sort of the current circumstances, the UK risks our GDP being sort of 6% lower by the 2030s than it would have been otherwise if our natural world wasn't kind of so damaged. But further breakdown could knock about 12% off GDP. That's the equivalent between sort of 150 billion to 300 billion, and that's actually more damage than was caused by the 2008 financial crash, which took about 6% off UK GDP. I think it's really interesting the 12% figure in the report kind of emerged from modelling which looked at sort of the impact of an antimicrobial resistant pandemic scenario. And I think one thing that really sprung out to me when I was covering it was kind of that when we went through the pandemic with COVID, we sort of looked a lot at like the sort of way it was affecting work, the way it was affecting government, etc. But we didn't kind of reflect on the fact that that pandemic kind of, it all sprung from our relation with nature and kind of the degradation of nature that we've sort of seen. I think we're at a pretty crisis moment at the moment, but I think with Labour, we've got a big opportunity there, and I think Steve Reid really has shown he's serious about this. I mean, his speech yesterday was very, he sort of set out his plans with water, which is very positive in terms of being a lot tougher on water losses. So I think one of the things he's announced is the Water Special Measures Bill, which could see bosses who fail to crack down on sewage spills going to prison or being banned from receiving bonuses. And I think the environmental improvement plan, kind of getting that underway is really important too, getting it completed by the end of the year. I think there's a lot of positive noises coming out of government, but I think we need to ensure that we're looking at things kind of across government and making sure that, looking at things in the round. So one thing I found really interesting in my coverage was I covered Sadiq Khan, his reintroduction of beavers in London. I think that's really interesting in a sense of, reintroducing a species that kind of we were pretty responsible for its extinction in England, but that we can now sort of use that reintroduction in a positive way in terms of flood management. I kind of love that there's the twin sort of issues there. We've done something really positive for both the people living in London, but also the beavers themselves. I thought that was a great story. So I think it's also great to see David Lammy using his first speech as Foreign Secretary to focus on the climate and nature crisis. I thought, particularly in light of kind of international events, that was really, really significant and great to see. And I think we've heard Ed Miliband talking a lot about kind of work he's doing with Steve on nature. So it'd be great to see sort of those three kind of working in tandem on this massive crisis that we're facing. So it really is, nature really is a very popular issue with voters, so I think that it makes a lot of sense to kind of keep that momentum going. But just to finish, I kind of wanted to bring up a bit of a personal example of where kind of nature and working with nature can really have a very positive effect, not just for the nature itself, but for the kind of the humans that are working with it. But my parents, they have a kind of thriving red squirrel community in their back garden, which is brilliant, and they've been working with their local red squirrel group, the Separate Red Squirrel Group. If anyone wants to get involved, membership is £15. But I think it's had a really positive impact for them and their neighbours in terms of sort of, I feel like from a mental health sense, it's like really positive, something to work towards, but also is having that kind of natural impact too. So I think looking at more sort of community initiatives like that is another really positive thing that Labour could maybe look at. I don't know, kind of having more sort of community schemes like that is really important. But yeah, I suppose we're at a big opportunity moment, but there is also a lot of room for improvement too. So yeah, thank you very much.
Back along and just ask some follow-ups for the comments you made before I open up to the audience. Megan, you mentioned, and it has been very welcome, the focus on international nature kind of being linked to international climate. I think both Labour but other kind of political parties have always kind of forefronted climate. And I guess what can we do for those in the room, or maybe storytellers in particular? Do you think we're doing enough to kind of link nature and climate together in people's minds to be able to tell that story?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that when I kind of first started covering this beat, I found it really interesting that sort of even from a New Statesman perspective, we had a lot of coverage of the energy sector, of kind of renewables, etc. But actually, you know, looking at nature is just as important, if not in some cases almost more important, because it's kind of the natural environment that we've allowed it to get into the state that it is. I think I do feel that Labour understand this, because as I said, kind of David Lammy making not only climate but nature the focus of his first speech as Foreign Secretary, but I think it was really interesting. Ed Miliband gave a speech to Green Alliance earlier this year where he, before the election, where he kind of alluded to the fact he's doing a lot of work with Steve Reed on this. So I think it's just important that there is that sort of guiding thread throughout when we discuss climate, also ensuring that there is that sort of that focus on the ecological crisis too. I think that's really essential, because they are twin crises that are very much interdependent. So yeah.
Thank you very much. And Joseph, to you mentioned some of the kind of lessons in the past. It's quite popular at the minute. Ed kind of mentioned past governments and what they've done on some of these issues. Keir Starmer in his conference speech last year kind of highlighted Harold Wilson, Tony Blair and Attlee in terms of like how we learn from them. What I think Labour have in the past have been a lot more comfortable talking about climate, but on specifically on nature, what do you think the lessons are from past Labour governments that could be taken now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think you're right there. You know, I think most kind of Labour Party politicians, staffers, activists, you know, you can connect climate change very intuitively to Labour's story about rebuilding industrial heartlands and, you know, jobs and kind of investment. But nature maybe sits a bit more in the kind of party story. And actually that's kind of unfair, because every Labour government has had an agenda on nature, and actually has been really successful connecting, particularly, you know, the conservation and restoration of nature to improving the access of ordinary people to natural environments. So I mentioned them, but you know, indulge me in a little bit of history. You know, going back to Clement Attlee's government, and even before that, you know, in the 1930s, you have ordinary working class people in, you know, northern industrial cities campaigning for greater access to the countryside. King Scout Trespass, you know, 400 walkers from Manchester and Sheffield. You know, a lot of those campaigners go on to form the Standing Committee on National Parks, and then 9 years later, a Labour government is elected, and with that, you know, those campaigns of ordinary people, you know, being the wind in their sails, you know, the National Parks White Paper is introduced, and then the National Parks Act 4 years later, and that gives us 10 new national parks over the decade that follows. You know, the Lake District that Keir Starmer talked about today, you know, the Peak District, Pembrokeshire, Snowdonia, I mean, you could go on. But what it also gave us at the same time as improving access was greater protections for nature. So that was the birth of what, you know, became Natural England, was the Nature Conservancy established by Clement Attlee's government, you know, the Nature Natural Resources Wales, Nature Scot, they're all, that is the legacy of that government. And Howard Wilson has his own agenda, country parks, empowering local authorities to build more green space for ordinary people. And then Tony Blair and the new Labour government have their rights of responsible access. And then the Labour-led government in Holyrood in Scotland at the turn of this century, granting ordinary people in Scotland the right to access pretty much all land in that country. So there's clearly a lot of history that the Labour Party can tap into, and there's a lot that is really important for them now. Nature is clearly not a primarily rural concern, although Labour has a lot of rural MPs now. So they will be thinking about the impacts with regards to farming particularly. But you have the Labour MP for Streatham and Croydon, Steve Reed, waxing lyrical about his connections to nature in his conference speech yesterday. That's got to be a really promising sign. There are clear ways you can connect nature to Labour's story, and I think the party is starting to do that.
Great, thank you very much. Back to you, Angela. You've got a past as an economist, or a current role as an economist.
It never goes away.
It never goes away. Yeah, inherent. A lot of kind of Keir Starmer's agenda has been about kind of public-private partnerships, and even in the speech today he was talking about the markets and the state working together. This isn't going to be done alone by the state, but what incentives do we need to be seeing from the government to kind of allow long-term incentives for business to be doing the right things in this area?
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think it's helpful. It's a helpful bit to add to what Joseph and Megan just said, because there's lots you can do in our conservation landscapes, but it's our productive landscapes where people are making money and they're running businesses that are really, really important in how we conserve nature. So one of the things I think is important about bringing climate and nature together and doing that in a way that business understand is that it rockets some sectors which otherwise aren't kind of that high on the profile suddenly up the agenda. So suddenly your agriculture sector, which is 30% of emissions when you take land use into consideration as well, suddenly becomes much more important when you add the nature agenda, because it is the most significant factor in how we restore nature, and having nature-friendly farming, which many farmers are trying to adopt for their own purposes, is really, really key. For us on the business side, it's about how we use those productive landscapes. How do we set an approach that farmers and fishers who've been given incentives to produce as much as possible but are actually facing depleted seas and degraded soils, give them the right incentives and give all the people in the supply chain, the buyers of the food and the investors in those businesses, a set of really clear signals that action they will take that allows those businesses to get to net zero, to get to a nature positive, productive system, will be rewarded, and they won't be out-competed by somebody else who isn't doing that. So one of the big things that we've looked at in this respect is something that we're calling the Living Planet Act, which is taking together some targets we already have. We have a target for climate emission reduction. We have a target for nature restoration in respect of the EIP targets, the Environmental Improvement Plan targets. We don't have any target at the moment for nutritional security. It's sort of just, we manage our land for food. We don't say explicitly what do we want from land. And as a result, we feed ourselves in a way that ultimately will undermine the ability for us to feed ourselves in the future. And we try and manage and encourage producers to do the same from their production systems. So what we want government to do is bring all of those targets together in respect of land use and say, how do all of those plans add up, and make sure your incentives are encouraging us to get all three of them. We've done the science and we say you can have all three, and in fact you will definitely not have any of them if you ignore either climate or nature or farming. You're not going to survive, and you won't get the political wins you need. So we're really trying to sort of reverse engineer the sort of 1940s, 50s agricultural policy, which was produce as much as possible, pour on chemicals, pour on fertiliser, rinse, repeat. That hasn't worked for us. It's not working. It's not working for farmers. They've got incredibly expensive inputs. There was a 300, 400% price spike in fertilisers that we saw following the Ukraine war exposed just how ridiculous it is. but even before that point, farmers are paying more for their inputs and getting very little margin out. And actually, can they farm in a way that gets them more margin, gets us more nutritious food in a way that's sustainable? So we're looking at that Living Planet Act being a thing that gives businesses comfort that government is taking this really seriously, a legally binding framework that says this is how our plan is held together. So even when government, I accept emissions are focusing on energy now, it starts to give a signal, send a really clear signal, do the energy work and show that they are actually going to be taking these other things forward as they have a bit more time, and we understand that's maybe not this year, but we'll be pressing for it next year very strongly.
Thank you. That affects our conversations with business. You do not underestimate just how much a bit of policy certainty and a bit of political certainty can provide to businesses, and what they've been asking for quite a long time. Just on that issue that Angela raised, Toby, about maybe not this year, not next year. You mentioned yourself, the Environment Act has given a lot of targets to be met, but at the minute the Labour government is very clearly focusing on the missions. Is how can we ensure that the UK still meets its nature targets, or how do we keep the pressure on them with the kind of like, where does this fit in with the mission conversation?
Yeah, I mean, so we are not as a country on target to achieve the Environment Act targets. This government is already committed to reviewing the Environment Improvement Plan to make it fit for purpose. That is a piece of really urgent work, because if there's any chance of us getting back on track for 2030, then that action has to happen now. But at the same time, we need to come out of the review of the Environment Improvement Act with plans that are actually going to address both the scale and the sort of important matters that are going to enable us to get on track. And this is at a time where you've also got a ministerial team grappling with the issues on water, which are urgent, grappling with the issues on ensuring that farmers are able to be sustainable right now. We literally could see farmers going bankrupt in ever-increasing numbers if government don't get on top of this. So I think that in terms of that review of the Environment Act and the Environment Improvement Plan, I expect us to see something early next year on that, and I think it's important that my committee and others put pressure on Steve Reid at a difficult time to actually keep their feet to the fire on that.
Thank you very much. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience now. If just what we'd like to hear is questions or things that provoke debate. We don't want to hear 3 minutes long rants or anything like that. Also, we are in the city of Cilla Black, so before you ask your question, I would like to hear what's your name and where do you come from. So if we start with this lady here at the front, the gentleman in blue at the back, and then the guy in glasses just behind.
So I think this question will provoke debate, because I'm just wanting to bring up the question about eating meat.
Sorry, you didn't say.
Oh, sorry, I
where
didn't.
you come from.
No, I didn't. Julia Barfield, so I'm from London. Yes, so the question about eating meat and the fact that a huge proportion of our land is actually just producing food to feed to animals that we then kill and eat, and it's just a very inefficient way to use our land. So I'd be interested to know what people think about that. It's obviously the elephant.
Thank you very much.
Yes, hi everybody, I'm Alec Taylor, I'm the Policy Director at Oceana. I think first of all a plea that when we talk about Labour's plan for nature renewal and national renewal, we don't forget about the ocean and the coastal communities that surround it, and I'd be interested in the views of the panel on the specific actions that a Labour government can take in that respect. And specifically, if I may, to Toby, pre-election you were very clear on Labour's commitment to banning destructive bottom trawling within our protected area network. There will be a consultation coming out shortly for around 40 protected areas that could remove bottom trawling from over 40,000 square kilometres of UK seas. Can we still count on your support in terms of that policy position in your new role as EAC Chair? Thank you.
Thank you. Chris Todd from Transgression Network. I actually live in Brighton, where we have one of the newest national parks under the last Labour government. My question is around water pollution. It's great. I think there's a lot of positivity in terms of what we heard, but water pollution from sewage is only part of the problem. There's a big issue from farming, and there's a big issue that's even less spoken about, which is water pollution and runoff from roads, which is virtually untackled at all. And for that we will need stronger regulation and stronger Environment Agency. So the question is really, what are you going to do, or what can we expect the government to do to tackle this aspect of water pollution so it's not lost under the general concern around water companies?
Great. Three nice small ones to start with: eating meat, the ocean, and sewage from farming. I'll let the panel kind of pick what they want to do, and I'll come back if any of the questions don't get answered. But Toby, I'll start with you just while there's a direct question.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, firstly, on land use, I think it's really important to say that we have a proper strategic land use framework so that everyone has an understanding about what we're going to do, how we are going to ensure that tackling nature, that being sustainable, having more encouraging sustainable farming methodologies, ensuring that we continue to be able to feed ourselves. All those things are considered within that. So I think the land use framework is really important. I look forward to government hopefully getting on with that. The point about our oceans, you're absolutely right, and much overlooked area. As you rightly say, we had a commitment prior to government for an end to destructive bottom trawling. I hope that will continue to be a commitment in government, and I hope that Steve Reid will get an opportunity at some point alongside his many other matters to confirm that it's still a policy and set out some kind of route towards that being delivered. And the point on water pollution from roads is incredibly important, because I think it isn't something that's talked about nearly as much. I think the government does have a strategic view around farming. I think that environmental land management is a part of the solution if that's working better. I think that issues like having a corridor, a nature corridor between farming and water courses is something that's already being considered, and I think that is prominent. But water pollution as a result of runoff from roads is much less talked about. I don't honestly know that the government has a strategy on that, but it would be something that's very much worth my committee and others considering how to government.
Thank you. Angela, can I go to you on the eating meat part?
Yeah, I was going to take that one.
Perfect. We're in sync.
And also talk to Eric's point about farming, because it all relates to what is a sustainable farming system for us. So WWF does think that we will have meat and dairy in our diets going forward, but we think we will have less of it, and that is because we can't afford planetarily the space it takes to have as much meat and dairy in our diets, and we won't be able to sustain ourselves healthily with the diet we have now. So we are looking at how we support diet shift and support farmers to produce more variety of food of all types, and that includes in the UK more production of vegetables and more production of beans. But there's lots of things that we need to do alongside that to address the farming system and support farmers to do things differently. So we use a lot of our land also for biofuels. We also use a lot of our land for growing feed, which we sell to other parts of the world. We import then food that has been fed by things that of course have been fed with sources that cause deforestation. So there's lots of issues in how we produce food differently and support consumers eat foods that can be produced sustainably. And then when we get it, that we don't waste it. So we waste 40%. The way we contract with farmers, we very tough standards are sometimes wasting food before it even gets off the farm. That's lower profit for the farmers. And then when we get it into the supermarkets, into our house, we waste another 40%. There's just enormous amounts of improvement we can make in that system, and it's so important for the farming system that we support them get as much out of land and it feeds us, rather than all these places where we're losing food from the supply chain. And that helps us then also mean that we don't have to use all of the land. We can make those buffer strips that Toby talked about, and also we're producing food at a higher value, such that we don't have things like the chicken sheds that sit on the banks of rivers, and all of that chicken shed to be polite, not very polite, ends up in the rivers. I know, what was the polite version? I don't know. That ends up in the rivers. So there's lots of the things that we need to do in looking at this whole system change, which will address the water quality. And I think you're absolutely right, Eric, that once we tackle the sewerage issue, people aren't going to be very pleased to find out we still have more clean rivers if we haven't dealt with those other issues. So I think it's really a good idea for Labour, whilst they're dealing with the water companies, to also start saying, okay, how do we have a framework that we actually deal with some of these other water issues as well?
And I think, I think Steve did hint at that yesterday in his speech, and so that's it. Feels like it starts the conversation. Megan, you wanted to come back on something there?
I just sort of wanted to go on the eating meat question, just sort of how you communicate it, because I think at the end of the day, we're probably not going to get everybody shifting off meat overnight. But I think that a good way of kind of looking at it and looking at that transition is looking at it as more than about just sort of transitioning away from meat and more towards eating food that is produced locally from sort of more local shops. You know, if you are going to eat meat, get it from the local butcher, and that's kind of a better way of sort of bringing in other elements of why this is so important. Because it's kind of like if you're getting more food from your local farmer, your local farmer's market, if you're lucky enough to have one near you, and kind of the local grocer, whatever, that's beneficial for the high street, that's beneficial for the local community. It's not just all about sort of getting people off meat for kind of, if that makes sense. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Joseph, was there anything you wanted to comment on?
Yeah, definitely. I think the eating meat question is great because it is obviously the elephant in the room, and a lot of our assumptions about how we're going to reduce emissions from agriculture rely on a kind of transition in the way we eat meat. But obviously, as Megan said, it's very culturally sensitive, and it's going to be challenging for any government to implement policy on that. So yeah, I think there are policy mechanisms that can help us do that, and they've been mentioned already, but in the land use framework and thinking about the ways we use land and what's farmed and where is going to be really helpful. But kind of the government strategy for farming, and obviously animals is really key to that. But it's more broadly a kind of strategy for the food system will be really important. And actually, at this point, I should plug a WWF report which set out some of those kind of pathways for farming at WWF and that West report. But yeah, and on kind of water pollution from farming and from roads, I actually think the kind of policy mechanisms that you need to shift that are actually quite broadly similar. And you're absolutely right that there is a focus on water pollution from water companies, but obviously agriculture and transport are really important parts of that. And a lot of these, kind of, like you said, stronger regulation, more funding for the environmental agency will be really important. But I actually think we need to start thinking about this holistically as well, because a lot of these problems do start upstream. And it was mentioned, that even in the River Wye you have a cluster of industrial chicken farms all in the same part of the country, which is absolutely disastrous for that river. The planning system is clearly not equipped in its current form to manage that kind of cluster of what clearly shouldn't all be in the same place. And so the planning system and the land use framework, I think, again, going to be really important for managing how we protect our waterways. And so those kind of elements, the government has a handle on them, so we just need to see them delivered now.
Great, thank you very much. I'll go back to the crowd for three more. So I think this gentleman here, Maya at the back, and the lady there in.
Thank you. I'm Peter Smith from Chester North and Western, Labour Party Secretary of the Party. Like Megan, I am a volunteer. I volunteer for Chester Wildlife Trust for butterfly conservation. The question, do the panel agree with me that the badger cull should be stopped? If you support nature and wildlife, you don't kill it. There are better ways of controlling bovine TB.
Thank you. My name is Ruth Johnson. I'm a councillor in Sheffield City Council. It's a question regarding the grouse shooting and the moorland that we're surrounded by, where we have no control over what's happening with that because it's privately owned by very rich people, and we've begged and they won't even talk to us. So is there any movement from government on grouse shooting and that monoculture that is killing so many creatures? And just to flag up that my MP is Olivia Blake, who is the species champion for the hen harrier, and I'd really like to back up her campaign and give a shout out for that. But we can't do anything without legislation, and please help us with the flooding in that respect because it's all upstream from us. Thanks.
Just wanted to make you word
Hello, Maya Singer-Hobbs, IPPR, and I swear this wasn't a setup because my question is about planning reform, which Joe just mentioned. But planning and nature are often posed as being in opposition to each other, and I was curious about the panel's reflections on whether that is true and how we could manage that, particularly since planning reform is obviously one of sort of pivotal to one of Labour's missions, and nature is too, and I was just curious about reflections on how we could make those work together.
Right, what I might do is I might start here and work down the line. So Joseph, do you want to come first?
Yeah, I promise that wasn't the plan as well. But I think I've said it. The land use framework is going to be really key. Managing the different ways we use land, the different kind of pressures on land use. Balancing nature restoration with house building, energy infrastructure, transport. So yeah, we look forward to seeing what the government announces on that. And I wanted to address the grouse shooting question directly because it is obviously a disaster for our natural carbon sinks that so much of peatland is used for that kind of activity. I have to say I'm not an expert on it, but I do think that stronger licensing in that area has clearly got to be looked at, and just in general, conversation about the way we use our natural carbon sinks and to be frank, who manages them, because some really good evidence by Guy Shropsold, the environmentalist and campaigner, he found that most of the UK's natural carbon sinks are on land that is owned by a very small number of landowners, kind of less than 1,000 landowners. So thinking about how you manage those really kind of actually nationally important natural carbon sinks, not quite part of the thinking yet, but needs to be.
I just wanted to come in on the planning reform question. I think the way that it's often communicated is kind of in opposition, that planning reform and nature are kind of in opposition with each other, and they really don't have to be. I think a good example of where we saw this badly communicated was with nutrient neutrality, which obviously Labour were in opposition when the kind of row kicked off about that ended up not backing the government sort of scrapping those regulations. So there are things that we can do within the planning system to ensure that the developments that we're doing don't impact nature in a difficult way. I think it is really about communicating that essentially planning is essentially about creating really lovely, beautiful spaces that people want to live in. And I think that's what it fundamentally is, and that's why it's so important. And I think if we're thinking about it in a sense of, if we're not thinking about it in that way, then we're kind of doing it wrong, if that makes sense. So I think it's really about making sure that when we are talking about people, talking about what we want our cities to look like, that that does include nature, it includes green spaces, it includes really lovely sort of places that people want to actually live. So that's why I would say.
Yeah, thank you. Firstly on the badger call, I went out 5 o'clock one morning with the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust to vaccinate badgers and to see really successful badger vaccination programme that they run in Derbyshire. I think the government are committed to moving away from the badger call. They're also committed to eradicating bovine TB. I don't think this will happen overnight. I think there are huge sensitivities here, but ultimately I think that is very much the direction of travel. On grouse shooting, you're absolutely right about Olivia Blake's campaigning on that as an MP close to me. I know how powerful that's been. The government in their party in opposition were committed to tackling peat burning, and I hope again we'll see more on that going forward. On the planning reform, this is an area that I think is incredibly important, and it is something I think is really appropriate for the Environmental Audit Committee, because it's largely the DCLG department that will be responsible for that. I absolutely believe the government is committed to ensuring that the urgent need to address the housing shortage doesn't come at the cost of the natural environment. But it is so easy for that good intention to not actually come out in real terms when the policy is delivered. So it is an area I'm really kind of committed to, and think that we'll see what the committee believe once they're actually appointed. But I do think it'd be an appropriate pre-legislative piece of work for the committee to do.
Great, thank you. And Angela, do you want to comment on?
Yeah, thank you. I can't comment on the badger or badger colour or the grouse shooting, but there's lots of nature organisations who work in the UK, and WF doesn't try and replicate what they do, but we are working in agriculture because UK agriculture is a bit of a principle for doing nature-friendly farming in the world, and how we find our way through these issues and how farming works alongside nature is really key, and how we use our land well and avoid those monocropping monocultures, which are either sometimes farm monocultures or grouse monocultures, is really important. And I just wanted to add a little bit to the discussion, because we talked about local production, which consumers can choose to buy locally. But I don't want anybody to go away with the idea that buying local is the solution for environmental problems. We are also an importer of food, and will continue to be an importer of food. And the reason we're interested in agriculture here is to get a sustainable agriculture system that we can start to also use to, support sustainable agriculture in other parts of the world. This is hard stuff. This is really, really hard stuff for small businesses, small producers, and the UK needs to be in the world leading on how we really use our land differently, and then procuring and being a market for places that are trying to do that differently. So this global agriculture problem, and I'm sure this is going to be part of CBD and our conversations with Colombia, who are an agricultural producer, how we do this and how we actually support those producers is absolutely key. And on a little bit on the planning reform as well, just to say, absolutely we can make those things kind of come together. In terms of housing and infrastructure, of course we need to do it well, but what you're doing there is having a less bad nature outcome. What we want to talk about is how do you get nature restoration to happen. So yes, definitely don't let your housing or energy infrastructure really compound a problem. Do it as good as you can, but it's never going to be a nature restoration agenda. So what we would say is you will win goodwill governments if you, while you're pressing forward with housing and infrastructure that we absolutely need for the housing crisis and to tackle the climate crisis, if you also give a path to nature restoration, and that's going to come from your land use framework, from what we're calling the Living Planet Act, how you're actually putting that in place, because otherwise people will object to everything, because there's so little left. They are right to object. You need to give them a plan about how you're going to restore, and then they will say, okay, go forward with the things we need to do, and I can see where you're taking forward my agenda elsewhere.
Absolutely, thank you. I think just use church prerogative, LSEF, we see kind of this rollout of the vital infrastructure over the next 5 years will be one of the defining political issues of this parliament, because there's no silver bullet for this. It's going to take conversations and work, but there is a way forward, but it's just some of these are very tricky problems. Absolutely. I think we've got time for one last round of questions. So the person here in the jacket, red jacket at the back, and then gentleman with the beard.
I'm Antonia Bunning. I'm trustee of a national charity called the Orchard Project, which supports community orchards, especially in urban and socio-economically deprived areas. And community orchards have a whole range of benefits in terms of nature, biodiversity, food production, community cohesion, mental health, well-being. So I guess my question is, partly, are community orchards on your agenda already? But how can we help make sure that they are seen as having real and tangible and strategic value rather than just a sort of fluffy nice to have?
Always good to have tangible value than fluffy nice to have, definitely.
I'm Miriam Rice from Ealing in West London, and we talked about the beavers earlier, and they're just about a mile away from my flat, so thank you for bringing that up, Megan. So what I'm just going to ask about was about some of the issues around about conflict minerals, because something I've been looking into recently, and in order to be environmentally friendly, we're having to have electric cars, we're having to also have batteries in our mobile phones and other devices, but often we forget about the fact that in order to obtain the minerals to make these batteries, such as the lithium and the cobalt, that we are, as well as harming children in slave labour and everything else going on, we're harming the environment. There's deforestation going on for a start. So I just really wondered a little bit about views from the panel as to what really the government can do in order to make sure that other countries around the world that we do need to rely on for the future of ourselves on this particular angle, getting these minerals. What can we do to make them work a little bit more environmentally friendly as well as more humanely as well?
Thank you. The gentleman here.
Thanks very much. I'm Tim Rakins, I'm Cabinet Member for Net Zero and Environmental Services in Brighton and Hove. Obviously completely agree with the comments made about incentivising the way land is used in the direction that we want to see. I'm not going to take credit for this idea because it was suggested to me, so I'm going to suggest it to the panel, which is that I believe at the moment the biodiversity net gain can't be used on land that is productive, and obviously we have a potential opportunity where that to change because of the big push on house building. There's going to be a hell of a lot of biodiversity net gain payments and opportunities, and were that able to be used on farmland and agricultural land, I wonder if the panel thinks that would help us in that direction.
Okay, I'm going to now go the opposite way down the path. So, Angela, I think maybe conflict minerals.
Yep.
For you.
Thank you.
nice
Conflict minerals.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a really important question, and I think we first of all need to remember how can we minimise all of the things. So the first thing is like demand reduction. So we shouldn't be replacing every car with an electric car and every other source of energy. We need to reduce our demand overall. That will help reduce the take from all these things. And then how do we source them well? And when we've sourced them, use them consistently. So one of the pieces of work that Green Alliance have done is on the cobalt and lithium in the electric vehicles we will have in the country by 2030 will be enough for us to, produce the next fleet of electric vehicle cars, as long as we don't just export all the scrap. So actually having arrangements where we're harvesting critical materials. Rolls-Royce do this already in some of their factories. It's a sensible thing to do, but we don't have to sort of be completely extractive. But you're right, in all sourcing that we have to do, how do we look at the labour laws, the environmental laws in those supply chains, and work with the countries that are providing them to ensure that we are not exploiting the people or. It's a really hard issue. I mean, we're finding different sources of lithium and cobalt all over the place now because they are so valuable, but they are still in a number of places where there are some really serious labour issues, so that's something we're going to need to work on. We're looking at supply chains in relation to agricultural commodities, but we are also, as WF International, looking at those critical material supply chains as well. And I was just going to say on the biodiversity net gain, we are not working on that now, and I've heard that suggestion too. The thing that I would say the parallel from the carbon world is where you have the offset purchased within the supply chain, so it's essentially an inset. So productive land being used for a biodiversity net gain, where it is being purchased by somebody else who's in the food supply chain, I think that could work very sensibly. The thing that is a slight concern that happens in the carbon space is if everybody is expecting their biodiversity net gain to come from the supply chain, you just end up with a set of people not really looking at the mitigation problems and expecting it all to be solved via land. You have this excess of demand, and until you flush that out, people aren't then doing the other work they need to do. So I think we should think about how we bring productive land in, because it has got huge potential to deliver some of the gains. But if we over-rely on it, we will tend to not do the other work we need to do, and then find out later that we're missing our targets.
Great, thank you. Sorry,
yeah, I mean, firstly on the community orchards, I would say it's not something that was sort of central in my mind, but I think it's really important. And as a local member of Parliament in Derbyshire, immediately thinking about sort of environments within my constituency that we really welcome that. So I'm grateful for you bringing it up, and I think the more people talk about it, the more it will be something that's in people's minds and in local authority minds. In terms of the mineral usage, I think that again is an important question, is a cross-cutting issue which might be something appropriate for the Environmental Audit Committee to look at. I think we have the Nature Conference in Colombia coming up. It's exactly the sort of thing Mary Craig, who will be leading the UK delegation, might well want to be part of the discussions that are happening out there. So I think it's definitely worth making sure she's sort of considered that aspect. And on the biodiversity net gain, I echo a lot of what you said there, Angela. I just think it's really important that we end up with this is a policy that is actually pretty innovative and is a positive thing. It enjoys cross-party support. So let's start from
vehicles. So I think the government really needs to kind of get a lot better at upcycling. Where we've got this infrastructure, but then when it becomes defunct, we're sort of exporting this waste away, and it's kind of like we should be looking at more innovative ways of using those materials to then go into new infrastructure. And I think by reframing it as an energy security issue, it kind of speaks to some of the other things we've spoken about this evening, which is that nature and climate, those two twin issues, need sort of twin solutions, if that makes sense. So I think that's
Thank you very much. Joseph?
Yeah, and I do actually want to say, Antonio, the community orchard sounds amazing. I wish I had one where I lived. I don't know much about community orchards specifically. I'd love to hear more, but I think actually it's a really good point because this government has already committed to introduce a community right to buy, and I think there are lessons that the government can actually learn from the Labour government in Scotland at the start of this century when they introduced community right to buy in 2003, which did apply to land. And it means that you now have assets that are community owned, where nature restoration is the primary aim. And they're really great examples. One of them is the Rewilding Highlands project, which, if you haven't heard of it, I would really recommend looking at. It's really inspiring. And I think this government can now learn from that. As part of their, what the inheritance that they leave to future generations could be a new kind of generation of community-controlled land, which is used for nature restoration. I think that's a really hopeful thing to think about.
Great, thank you very much. Where are we standing between you and your evening drinks? I think we've got time for one more round, and then we'll do follow up as that. The gentleman at the back who's been desperate for a few rounds now. The lady here at the front, and the lady at the back she's coming out anytime.
Thank you. Hello, Simon Dow from Chester Zoo. I just want to pick up on a point that Angela made earlier. So although we're one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, we also, through our consumer behaviour and consumer activity, are depleting nature worldwide. So I was interested to know what the government plan to do in relation to that, and in particular whether or not they're going to bring in the much awaited legislation on deforestation-free commodities that was promised in the Environment Act but not delivered by the last government. And there may be an opportunity to learn from the EU and the EUDR, which is the equivalent legislation in the EU, which has had some issues, so maybe an opportunity to actually do a better job. Thank you.
Do the lady back first.
Hi everybody, I thought I'd stand up because I'm not known as the tallest person in the world, and I thought I'd introduce myself because I've been feeling a little bit othered. I'm a farmer, and I grow livestock and brassicas. Okay, so imagine a lot of cabbages followed by a lot of cauliflowers, and if you've ever smelt a wetsuit after a long summer, that's what Cornwall smells like when the brassicas are harvested. So this new is great interest here today. We've been involved in environmental projects at home since the 1990s. We built our first carbon neutral houses in 2004. We are not othered, we are actually the engines of our own change. I'd like to ask a nice end of evening question to the panel. Number one, if I was to come to your house and go through your larder, can you put your hand on your heart and say that it is filled with wonderful products that were grown by British farmers? We were served up delicious apples in break yesterday.
I'm just going to ask you to, this was the last round, so just...
What's in your larder? Is it all by British, or would you hate me to come in and find the funny shaped jam pot?
Thank you very much, yeah. And at the front here.
Chacha Amy from the ends of the...
Oh, just speak up.
Of course, sorry. I was wondering, we know that we need a lot of strategies when it comes to sort of nature and solving these joint crises, but we haven't heard much about Labour's plans for chemicals. And I really want to know from Toby, we're going to make sure that this really important policy area doesn't get forgotten, particularly in the light of Brexit and the fact that we're behind Europe on this.
Great, okay. So for expediency, I'm probably just going to give one question per person. So Angela, can I give you the international
Yes, I think Simon wants Toby to answer as well, but yeah, I very much, I'll just support getting that legislation over the line. So we've had this what's called due diligence legislation, which requires major companies to look at their whole supply chain and ensure they are not buying anything that has contained illegal deforestation, and we haven't got it over the line yet. It's really critical, and early action on that would address this footprint issue that we are not complicit in undermining supply chains that we need to rely on in the future.
Great, thank you. I'm going to come to Toby last, but Joseph, any chemicals or?
I'm more than answer chemicals.
Right.
I'm sorry, I just don't know enough about that. No, I just wanted to quickly say that thank you for coming to the event and for bringing the perspectives of farmers. Obviously, the changes that need to happen in the way we grow foods, if we're going to meet kind of environmental and climate targets, will never work if they're done by othering farmers. Clearly, it needs to be done working hand in hand with them. So yeah, thank you for coming and engaging. And yeah, I don't know.
Any funny shit jam jars you want to declare?
I won't answer.
I'll just echo that. Yeah, thank you for adding your perspective. But I will admit, I do have some British-grown damson jam, which my dad has made in my fridge. So but that's about it. To be honest, I don't really know about anything else. But yeah, it's good jam. So.
Thank you. I'll give you all three, and then you can wrap up, please.
Okay. Great. Well, firstly, thank you so much to everyone for all the contributions. They've been really great sessions, really superb questions. So thank you for that, Simon. In terms of the deforestation question, I was recently, just last week, at a meeting in London with the Colombian delegation ahead of COP16. Mary Craig was there, and we're listening very attentively to the issues that face Colombians and many other areas who are hugely dependent on their revenues, on their agricultural revenues, and so we do need to make sure that the British government is doing all they can to try and ensure that our relationship with other nations is encouraging sustainability of the entire planet, and I'm confident that we will be attempting to do that at COP16. But in terms of deforestation, I'm not certain where Steve, how high that is on his agenda, and so I can't honestly answer the question in terms of what the government's going to do, but I think it's an important one. In terms of the question like chemicals, absolutely, I do hear the importance of that, and I hope that it's something that the committee may well get an opportunity to look more seriously at. I was on a panel earlier this week where people were speaking really powerfully about some of the issues around chemicals, and it's something that I'm informing myself more on than I knew previously. On the issue of buying British, I'm sort of able to say that I go to a farm shop which is 300 yards up the road from me, and that much of the vegetables and eggs that I eat are all local, but shamefully I do have Bon Maman French jam in my fridge. Bon Maman are actually have a very fascinating history to do with saving people during the Holocaust. So they have merit of their own. So I'm kind of guilty as charged on the jam, but I think we do, and more importantly, I think we all should encourage people to do what they can, not just to buy British, but also to look at where they buy British. Can they support retailers that aren't just the big supermarkets? Can they support farm shops, and try and make sure that we sort of spread the wealth a bit more, not only buying British, but making sure that we buy British in sustainable ways.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to the audience for some great questions there and for your engagement. And please give a round of applause to them.